and welcome to Season 4, Episode 20 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Christina Hagen, coming to you live from Cape Town. So we have over 140 episodes recorded and available on YouTube. So if you miss out because of load shedding or your Tuesday nights have become busy, never fear, you can always catch up later. Tonight, I'm very pleased to welcome my colleagues Sam Ralston-Paton and John Gibbs to the show to speak about their work to mitigate the impacts of renewable energy on birds. Sam Ralston-Paton is BirdLife South Africa's Birds and Renewable Energy Project Manager. She works with consulting bird specialists, ornithologists, environmental impact assessment practitioners, government and the renewable energy industry to help ensure the impacts of renewable energy on birds and their habitats are understood and minimized. She has an MSc degree in conservation biology and has been actively supporting nature-friendly transition to renewable energies for over 10 years. Sam is passionate about environmental sustainability and enjoys challenging herself and others to have a more positive impact on the planet. And presenting with Sam today is John Gibbs, who joined BirdLife in July of this year, having worked on the development and financing of major infrastructure across the world with a particular focus on utility-scale renewable energy in South Africa. And John is also a keen birder, which always helps. John is based in Joburg and is building relationships with the key stakeholders in the renewable energy sector to ensure that the impact of renewable energy on raptors and other species are fully taken into account, and in the siting, construction, and operation of new wind, solar, and other renewable resources in South and Southern Africa. So we're very excited to have you both joining us this evening, John and Sam. So please do, I think John is presenting first. So John, please turn on your video, and there we go. And I will stop sharing so that you may share your screen.
Thanks very much, Christina, and good evening, everyone. Let me start by getting the screen up and running. As Christina just said, I'm John Gibbs, and I recently joined BirdLife South Africa to work with Sam on the Birds and Renewable Energy Project, having spent many years working in the renewable sector in South Africa on the project side. So Sam's name, in fact, may be familiar to many of you, as she's developed the Birds and Renewable Energy Project from, frankly, a standing start over the last 10 years. And she's, I think, done a couple of conservation conversations previously. This evening, we're going to be looking at the recent growth of wind energy in South Africa, explaining why this matters in the context of BirdLife, and then taking a look at the ways that BirdLife South Africa is working to minimize and mitigate those impacts. Sam, if you could click forward. Great. So this map just shows the potential that renewable energy has, and wind energy in particular has, to make a really significant contribution in meeting the challenge of decarbonizing our energy supply in South Africa. And recent studies by the Global Wind Energy Council, the International Finance Corporation, have highlighted this, that we're really blessed with excellent wind resources, particularly in North Africa, the Sahel region, but also in Southern Africa. Through the very successful renewable energy independent power producer program here in South Africa, we've become one of the leading participants in the sector in Africa, and recognized globally for the strength of the processes which have been engaged with here. And we have real potential to grow this both on the onshore and in the longer term offshore sectors. Sam. South Africa to date has developed an extensive range of wind resources and wind projects across the country, but particularly, you'll note from the left-hand side, in the western half of the country. Most of the development is located in the Eastern Cape, in the south, and then the Western Cape, and also moving up into the Northern Cape. And the Karoo also has excellent potential. You'll note that this potential remains fairly entrenched when you look at the map, the wind map on the right. And there's a drop-off as we move from west to east. But that doesn't mean that we have poor resources in the east. It just means we have less attractive resources. So if we move to the next slide, this map, which demonstrates the planned capacity of the country, is important because it shows how BirdLife South Africa has to work with the industry to recognize the changing trends in development. To date, most of the development has been on the west and side of the country, really where the red dots are, and there's still a lot of potential there. Probably the best wind resource is down into the Eastern Cape and then moving up onto the coast through the Karoo. However, there is a huge amount of interest at the moment in developing wind power projects on the eastern and the northern part of the country, up into Mpumalanga. And that's reflecting the need to make use of the grid, the strength of our grid in that part of the country. You'll all be aware that transmission grid is now becoming constrained in the Western and the Eastern Cape. But also we have fantastic resources up there and sites up there, particularly around the old coal power plants and mines, where we need to see a just energy transition undertaken. We need to start to develop these sectors to decarbonize, but give people opportunities to lead full and useful remunerative lives wherever they happen to be living. And so what we're seeing now is that developers are looking at the Mpumalanga area as the next frontier. And that's throwing up some interesting challenges in terms of its potential impact on bird life. Okay, next slide. Thanks. BirdLife South Africa recognizes that wind, and for that matter, solar energy, is here to stay. And so we are seeking to engage with the sector, government, developers, in a positive and constructive manner. We recognize that the wind and renewable sector is important as an alternative for environmentally damaging coal-fired generation. And it also has an important role to play in decarbonizing our energy mix as part of South Africa's response to the challenges of climate change. As we'll explore further, both wind energy and the related transmission infrastructure poses some specific risks to wildlife. And BirdLife South Africa is keen to play its part in minimizing the risks and the impacts that result. A key part of our work has been to engage with both government and developers and funders to identify and promote the best practice mitigation measures with a view to minimizing the negative impacts that might arise from renewable energy. That said, we must stress that we always reserve the right to object to developments where mitigation measures simply cannot reduce risks to acceptable levels. Could we go to the next slide then, Sam? Yeah, before we move on too much further, I thought it might be worth including this slide just to illustrate the scale of wind turbines now being installed. I've been working in this sector for many years, and I've seen the way that turbines have been increasing significantly in size. And it's a trend which is only going to continue. Here, we're looking at probably an average-sized 3 megawatt onshore wind turbine. That'll typically provide power to about 3,000 households. These plants are large. The hub height there is around 100 meters. That's from the ground to the main generator, at the center of the blades. And the rotor diameter there is about 120 meters. Now, looking at it from the ground, when you see these turbines moving, they often don't seem to be moving that fast. But that's kind of a trick of the eye because these wind turbines are so large. They're typically rotating at around 25 revolutions per minute, moving at perhaps 150 meters per second. and they're sweeping an area of more than 11,000 square meters. This level of movement presents a real challenge to birds, who, as we'll see in the next slide, have simply not evolved to cope with massive moving structures sharing their airspace. Sam. Avifaunal vision, and here we're looking at, of course, at a vulture, has primarily evolved for food finding and detection of predators. As a result, birds really don't see the world around them in the same way that we do. Some birds perceive the world in the ultraviolet spectrum, and others have evolved high visual acuity, but at the expense of low contrast abilities. Some have binocular vision to assist with foraging, and others, such as cranes and bustards, can only see either side of their skull, giving them effectively a blind region directly in front of them. Most hunters and scavengers, despite having excellent vision for detecting prey below them, really don't spend much time focusing on the flight path directly ahead. And given that they've had millions of years to evolve in what has essentially been empty space, it's not difficult to understand why that's the case. We have a real problem globally with birds hitting turbine blades. And the main physiological reason for this is thought to be because they see what's called motion smear. The retina can't perceive the motion of the blade. And so they just continue on as if there was no obstacle in front of them. You actually experience a similar effect when you look at a propeller on a plane, or a helicopter's spinning rotors, or even a bicycle's wheels, the spokes on a wheel. It's all examples of motion smear. But in the case of raptors, their ability to see contrast, especially in low light, is about 10 times worse than it is for us. And this means that motion smear is causing real difficulties and real risks of collision. Sam, yeah, thank you. When we look at the evidence, particularly using the carcasses found beneath turbines in South Africa, it's very clear that while a range of species are affected, it's the raptors. I think, in fact, if we get the whole of this picture, we'll see the other piece of the graph. Yeah, if you look to the bottom of the right-hand side, you'll see that the raptors at the bottom are the ones who are most at risk. And as we'll explain in a moment, the impact on their populations can be the most severe. Moving to the next slide, just to give you a couple of examples of species which are particularly at risk. First of all, are vultures. Of course, both Cape and whiteback are endangered species in South Africa. And also, next slide, the Varosa eagle, one of my personal favorites, but it's a bird particularly at risk because its habitat unfortunately overlaps with the main locations for a number of the really large wind farms in this country. Next slide. Other species which are affected also include the large terrestrial birds, cranes, bustards, and korans. However, in this case, their problem's often a slightly different one because they have a tendency to fly into the transmission lines, which of course are built to connect the wind plants to the main grid and to urban supply centres. And so we also need in our work to take account of the impact on transmission lines. I'm going to hand over to Sam at this point, who'll take you through some of the latest results regarding the species most at risk. And she'll start to address the key question for us, which is what do we need to do to tackle this issue?
Right. Good evening, everybody. Thanks to John for giving us a nice introduction there. So in South Africa, thanks to the fact that most wind farms are legally required to monitor the impacts on birds, and they share those results with us, BirdLife South Africa, have the unenviable job of maintaining a database of fatalities. We're beginning to get a fairly good idea of which species are at risk of turbine collisions. And estimates of the, I must stress, their absolute minimum fatality rates. So the results I'm presenting on this graph here are based on the observed carcasses, and it doesn't take into account the fact that when they do the carcass searches, the carcasses might be overlooked because they're outside of the search area, they're not one of the turbines that are searched, or they could be removed by scavengers, or simply the searchers could overlook them. But it is useful to begin getting an idea of which species are at risk. And I don't expect to go through all these details, but one of the things that should immediately jump out at you is the enormous number of jackal buzzard fatalities we've had. We've had at least 141 jackal buzzard fatalities. 21 different wind farms have reported it. And this is by far the species that we flagged as needing a lot more research, because although it's not a threatened species at the moment, it is endemic. And we don't know whether these numbers are significant for the population or not. Some other species that are affected, martial eagle, it's an endangered species. We've had 12 fatalities as a result of turbine collisions at 11 different wind farms so far. Burroughs eagle, it's a vulnerable species, and it causes a lot of wind farms and a lot of conservationists a whole bunch of headaches because they tend to overlap with areas of really good wind resource. Black harrier, I'm going to talk a little bit about that just now. Secretary birds, we didn't expect really to have secretary bird fatalities because they spend most of the time walking around, but unfortunately we've had 8 different fatalities so far at 5 different wind farms. And just to give you some background, this is from, I think it was 33 operational wind farms who have been monitoring their impacts for between less than a year, and the longest monitoring has been over an 8-year period. But it just gives you an extent of the concern. Cape vultures, it's giving us huge headaches in the Eastern Cape, where there's again a good overlap with their territories and areas of good resource, and importantly, an area where there's a strong need for socioeconomic development and economic investment. And we've even unfortunately had some whiteback vulture fatalities up in the Northern Cape. Again, I do not expect you to engage with all the detail of this. But what I do want to drive home is that pretty much all wind farms that have been monitoring for any extent of time, except those that are particularly small, have reported fatalities of threatened bird species. Sometimes one, but sometimes more. So it's not a unique or isolated problem to wind farms in South Africa. One of the questions that people love to answer, particularly in Europe, is, well, how many birds are killed by wind turbines? And as I mentioned earlier, the number of birds that they observe beneath the turbine aren't exactly the same as the number of actual fatalities, because, as I said, scavengers could remove the carcasses or searchers might just overlook them. But there's some fancy stats that they can do. There's a very amazing program developed in the States called GenNest, and you can estimate the exact number of birds that are killed per turbine per year. And in South Africa, we're currently looking at around 2.8 birds killed per turbine per year, which isn't an enormous number. Some people think that if you go to a wind farm, you're going to see the area beneath littered by carcasses. But at some sites, particularly one site, it is much higher. So unfortunately, one wind farm up in the Northern Cape has almost 50 birds killed per turbine per year. And this is largely swifts and related to really good rains and an outbreak of insects in the area. But we can also tell you, oops, sorry, going ahead of myself here, is that actually had over 200 different species reported. And some work we did with Bonica Perald at UCT, we looked at the overlap with the species around a wind farm and which species had been reported as fatalities. And we estimate that around 42% of the birds species are likely to show up as at least 1 or 2 fatalities in the area. So although we do focus on the priority species, the threatened species, it really is a big diversity of species. And when you start looking at figures like 49 birds per turbine per year, we also have to start asking those difficult questions: is what does this mean for ecological functioning and ecosystem services? So going back to the threatened species, where as conservationists we often forced to focus our attention on. The example of the black harrier for me is such a stark reminder of why it's so important to do the work that we are doing, why it's so important to have post-construction monitoring, something we had to fight quite hard for in the early days, and importantly, why it's important to share information as quickly as possible. So in the early environmental impact assessment for wind energy facilities, although black harriers were considered a priority species because they're found in relatively low numbers, and they tend to be seasonal, and they also tend to fly below the rotor-swept area, most early environmental impact assessments kind of overlooked impacts on this species and didn't really make strong recommendations for mitigation. Unfortunately, we now had 11 different fatalities of black harrier at 5 different wind farms. Initially, when we first started learning about the fatalities, we thought, well, maybe it's isolated to that one particular site. Unfortunately, we're wrong on that, and it does seem to be fairly widespread. The worry is that the species is endangered. It's endemic to Southern Africa, and it's got a really small population. We're looking at less than 1,300 mature adults. And when we started learning about these fatalities, the Fitzpatrick Institute was very quick to do some research. Francisco Cervantes did some population viability analysis where they modeled what the population is currently doing, which is the top graph you'll see on your screens there, and you'll see that's not doing particularly well. They then modeled what an additional 1 adult fatality a year would do to the population. And then they looked at 3 and 5 adults. And what they found is that if we increase the adult fatality rate by just 3 adults a year, the population is likely to go extinct in 100 years. If we increase it to 5 adults a year, it's likely to go extinct in 75 years. And the really scary thing is that if you look at the minimum fatality rates that I presented earlier, which don't really take into account the overlap with the species distribution, it's just averaged across all wind farms in South Africa, we're currently looking at a rate of around 4 adults a year. So it's a matter of survival for some that we address this problem, and that we address this problem quite urgently. So what do we need to do? That's the big question. And in environmental management, decisions, the good practice is that decisions are framed in terms of what's known as the mitigation hierarchy. It's embedded in our national legislation, and then there's international guidance supporting this. So the idea here is that we first need to do everything to avoid impacts. If avoidance isn't possible, we then minimize, restore, and then everybody's least favorite thing to do is the offset impacts. And the reason for this is that options quickly run out as you go down the mitigation hierarchy. Avoidance tends to be much cheap, and it's the results are much more certain. As you go down that mitigation hierarchy, there are increasing risk of costs and delays, and an increasing risk of failure. And certainly when it comes to birds and energy, one of the biggest risks, I think, is lack of robust data to verify offsets are in fact effective. So let's talk about avoidance a little bit more. this can happen at different scales. So it can happen at the scale of a wind farm, so national scale, where do we put the wind farms? And all the way down to where do we put the wind turbines themselves. And when it comes to deciding where to put wind farms and wind turbine locations, it's all about robust data and robust data collection. And BirdLife South Africa and EWT have developed guidelines for data collection, which are now referenced in national legislation. And while robust environmental impact assessments are really needed, they're essential, one of the challenges with EIAs is that they're limited in space and time. We are asking developers to pay for studies that take at least a year, sometimes 2 years. But sometimes research needs to take place over much longer time frames. So we really need to grow our knowledge to underpin EIAs to really help inform the decisions that are made by the specialists and the government authorities. There's some really good work that's being done in South Africa to support site screening, the wind farm location. BirdLife South Africa has developed habitat suitability models for our threatened species. Over 60 habitat suitability models are available to anybody who wants to find out, any developer. They can go to the National Environmental Screening Tool and they will know whether they're overlapping or likely to overlap with habitat of threatened species. And there's an increasing amount of really amazing tools developed by researchers for some of the more tricky species. So a bearded vulture risk map was developed by Reed et al. In 2015. Fortunately, we've got pretty much no overlap with wind farms and bearded vulture. Burroughs eagle, there's an amazing risk model developed by Megan Murgatroyd, recently released Cape Vulture risk map, which amazingly is going to be linked to the National Site Screening Tool. And there are more plans to come. There's a plan to develop maps for Black Harrier and for Marshall eagle. So I'm going to hand back to John to talk a little bit more about options to minimize or mitigate impacts.
Thank you, Sam. I've managed to get my screen back, so I'm now looking at the same pictures that everyone else is. So yes, mitigation is really important. Even if we've applied best practice to avoid risk through the careful siting of both wind farms and the individual turbines, the risk of fatalities during operations may remain a very real concern. So a key part of BirdLife South Africa's work and its engagement with government, environmental practitioners, bird specialists, and the developer community has therefore been to identify and promote best practice around mitigation. I'm going to talk in a moment specifically about two mitigation strategies, shutdown on demand and blade patterning, that are particularly current at the moment. But there are other approaches. These include curtailment, and that means the operation of a wind farm is actually managed to minimize collision risks at certain seasonal or diurnal times. It might be that you're dealing with migratory birds coming through, or it might be diurnal behaviors by birds and or bats. You can also have on-site deterrence. And there's a number of ways of doing this, but perhaps one of the more interesting and indeed perhaps more obvious ones will be carcass clearance. So if you're in an area near where vultures could become a problem, the last thing you want is cattle dying near your turbines and then attracting the vultures to scavenge. And so quick carcass clearance can be a really important method of reducing site attractiveness for scavengers. If we move on to the next slide, and looking at shutdown on demand. There are two types. Shutdown on demand is kind of exactly what it sounds like. You know, a bird that you don't want to come into conflict with your wind turbine is approaching. And so the simple solution to avoid a collision may be simply to switch off your wind turbine for a relatively short period of time as the bird or birds flies past. And two different techniques have been developed for this, for shutdown on demand. The first and the most commonly used in South Africa is observer-led. And you can see this here. You have observers positioned around the wind farm, looking out for birds approaching. And when they see one of the at-risk species, perhaps a vulture or a varroa, something like that, moving, coming within a couple of kilometers of a turbine, then they will phone the operator of a wind farm, warn them that to be aware that there may be a problem coming. As the bird gets closer, it might move into the orange zone. Again, a further warning. And finally, if the bird moves too close to a specific turbine into the red zone in the figure shown here, then the observer will phone the operator, who will switch off that turbine for, and it's quite a short period of time. It might just be 20, 30 minutes as the birds go past, and then it's safe to restart. The impact of this on the revenue from a wind farm, in fact, is quite small, probably only about 1% of annual revenues. So something that is actually, that side is affordable, but it is a complex process. You need to train your staff, you need to make sure they have vehicles to get around the site, you need to make sure you've got good communications between them and the operator for the wind farm. So this is a technique that requires real commitment on the part of the operators. And I'm glad to say we are seeing that level of commitment from at least some of the developers in South Africa, who are really committed to trying to minimize this risk if they can. An alternative approach, which hasn't been tested in South Africa, but has been used in other parts of the world, is automated shutdown on demand. So this attempts to achieve the same results using visual or radar-based technology, perhaps in association with AI-based data gathering systems. Recognizing the value of this technique, BirdLife South Africa is looking to monitor implementation of automated systems in South Africa. But more immediately, we're looking to work with one of the developers who has particular experience in observer-led SDOD to perhaps draft a handbook and or prepare a training program, which will help other independent power producers implement the same approach. Okay, Sam, we can move now. The other really promising mitigation measure in which BirdLife South Africa has recently been engaging with industry is what's called blade patterning or painting. So in this approach, at least one blade on an otherwise white turbine is partially painted in a contrasting color. In South Africa, we have to use red to comply with CAA aviation regulations, and whether it's red or black, which is another alternative. The aim is to make the turbine more visible to birds. A blade patterning experiment at Småla wind farm in Norway, which has been going on for a number of years now, has shown really promising results. It's resulted in a 70% reduction in annual fertility rates over an fatality rates over an extended period. And even equally importantly, or perhaps more importantly, it's shown a 100% reduction in fatalities for the white-tailed eagle, which clearly is one of the key species in that area. Unfortunately, the technique hasn't been fully tested elsewhere. And so at this point, South Africa is leading the world in exploring this technique. It's a similar experiment has been initiated at the Umoya wind farm in the Western Cape very recently, in which some but not all turbines have been painted. And this will allow us to tell whether there is over time, the aim is to build a body of evidence as to whether or not the technique works. A number of other developers in South Africa are currently looking to do further testing of the approach, because there's a general sense in the industry that this, if it works, is a really good, relatively costless approach, because the key here is that you would paint the turbines before they're put up. You do it in the fabrication yard, and the cost to the developer then is very low, and hopefully the results are very successful. So we have recently prepared a paper. Sam is a co-author with Sawia's Wind Energy, as South Africa Wind Energy Association, and that paper is available on the BirdLife website. And at the end of this presentation, you'll see a QR code. Click on that and it will take you through to our publications page, and you'll find a copy of this paper that you're welcome to download and read at your leisure. In conclusion, go to the next slide. Yeah, I mean, in conclusion, we're hoping that this conversation's provided some insight into the ways in which the potential conflicts between utility scale wind farms and BirdLife can be resolved, and the work that we're doing in this area. As it says here, vultures might not look ahead when they fly, but we can. And therefore we have a responsibility to do what we can to ensure that the impact on these species is as limited as possible. If we go to the next slide. Yeah, so you may be wondering, how can you help? Well, this is actually an area where your support is really valuable. You'll have seen these actions in other talks, in other contexts, but fundamentally, first of all, collecting data is really important. Using BirdLife to record your sightings helps us build a picture of where the species are located. Raise awareness and engaging constructively in the development process, particularly the environmental impact assessment process. Our view is that we're trying to engage constructively in this sector because we do need change. We all recognize that the biggest single challenge facing mankind at the moment is climate change. And renewable energy has a really important part to play in tackling that challenge. So we can't ignore it, but what we can do, and I have to say the developers and government and environmental practitioners are all united in this. We can do our best to avoid the problems. If there are problem projects, let BirdLife South Africa know so that we can then work with industry and others to take action. Fundamentally as well, please support us. Your funding helps the work that Sam's been doing for the last 10 years and the plans that we have to build this project, both in South Africa, but also hopefully into the region around us, where they are going to face similar problems as they develop their renewable energy industry. We need to support research, and we need to grow the capacity of our birders and biologists, who are crucial for undertaking the primary research, and also assisting in things like shutdown on demand, where we need people who can be out in the field working with local communities who are often employed to work in these roles to do a better and more effective job. And with that, I think we come to the end of our presentation. We'd just like to thank you, just mention and thank our sponsors, Investec and the Lewis Foundation, who are making our current work possible. And the acknowledgements there refer to a huge range of people, all of whom have played important roles in the research that's formed the backbone of the work that we talked about today. And once again, just to remind you, the QR code on the left there will take you to our webpage, Birds and Renewable Energy webpage on the BirdLife South Africa website. And there you'll find lots of additional information that you're very welcome to download. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John and Sam. That was brilliant. And I've always been such an admirer of the work that the renewable energy program has done, especially in terms of being proactive and engaging with the wind energy industry to try and help develop, as you said, work constructively with them rather than just trying to oppose the developments. So well done to both of you, and keep up the good work. So we have quite a few questions. And I see there have been some questions posted in the chat It's quite hard for me to keep track of those as other messages come in. So please do rather put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. And before we get going on to the questions, I just want to remind everyone that we will be back again in 2 weeks' time with another webinar. Again, another one of my colleagues, Andrea Angel, who's the head of the Albatross Task Force, will be sharing some of their latest work. So please do join us for that. Okay, Sam and John, I hope you're ready for some questions. They are pouring in. We'll do our best to get through as many of them as we can, but not keep you here all night. So the first question from George Ledek, asking whether all wind power operators are required to publicly disclose their bird and bat fatality monitoring data. So John, I see you're nodding there. Do you want to take that one? You're muted. Still muted? Sam,
No, that one's
there we go.
Sam. She's been in this space much longer than I have.
Yeah, that's a good question, George, and it's not
Sam,
one that has a.
I can hear you, Sam.
I'm not. No, okay, I can now.
Okay. Yeah. I'm saying that there's no straight answer to that. So wind farms that were had environmental approval to 2011, 2012 weren't obliged to share that information with stakeholders, BirdLife South Africa included. So there are 1 or 2 wind farms that are not legally obliged, but all wind farms that have environmental approval today in South Africa are required to share it with BirdLife South Africa. Where we allowed to share that information with the public is a bit of a legal grey area. And we've kind of been playing it safe, and we've agreed with the Department of Environmental Affairs that we will provide an overview summary of what the impacts are. So, for example, the information that I shared with you tonight, and then we will also share those monitoring results and the monitoring reports with specialists who are conducting impact assessments on adjacent wind farms nearby, and we can also make that information available to researchers. I don't agree with the fact that that information is publicly sensitive, but some wind farms do, and I think it's a sacrifice worth making to ensure that there is across the board cooperation with everybody.
Okay, great. Thanks, mate. Hopefully that will change in future and things will become more transparent. Yeah. I'm just looking for a question that I saw earlier. Yeah, so a couple of people in the chat, and now I see Laura has put it in the Q&A box, is asking how long it takes with the shutdowns on demand, how long does it take for that blade to stop moving?
John, do you want me to answer that?
If you know the answer, please do. Right, I'd only make an educated guess.
The answer is it depends. It depends on how well the communication with the wind farm operator goes. It depends on the nature of the turbine itself. But at the one facility that we visited, the turbine slowed down to a stop within less than a minute.
Okay. Yeah. That's good. That's good to know. And then another question from George, asking still about the shutdown process, whether when the bird spotter sees a bird, are the operators obliged to obey that or to act on that, and is there verification or a consequence if they don't?
George, you getting to the heart of some of the more difficult challenges there. So yeah, the oversight and enforcement of operational phase mitigation is a very real challenge in South Africa and probably elsewhere in the world too. So I guess the verification with that is, are there any fatalities, and what procedures they have at different wind farms. So some wind farms do have a system where they report all the calls that the observers made to shut down, and whether it was effective or not, and whether it was effective at mitigating or avoiding the impacts or not. Unfortunately, not everybody has such wonderful systems in place. And then, yeah, they might be legally obliged to do that if it is written into the environmental management program as a requirement. But again, whether they actually do is not always clear.
And I think just this is one of the reasons why we are keen to work with the wind farms which are successfully implementing SDOD to develop some best practice guidelines and training as well, because it's so that people really understand. They need to understand what good should look like. There are then what the question of enforcement is something that we're actually also talking with the banks about at the moment, because they keep very close watch on the environmental performance of these wind farms. And so that again is a way to apply gentle pressure. If the problems emerge, we'd like the funders may well be the first line of attack to do something about that. Government is much further down the line.
Yeah, going to the investors is a great approach.
It's the Sunday. You always want to avoid the Sunday Times risk of a bad story.
Yeah. And so there's two questions that I'm going to group because they're similar, from Ted and Evelyn. So asking about different mitigation options for making the blades more visible or more apparent to the birds. So Ted asking whether birds, how well they hear, and whether whistles on the blades could help deter birds, and Evelyn asking about putting reflectors on the blades. Do you know of any work other than the painting of the blades that's been done sort of in that same vein?
You look like you're about to answer, Sam. Do you want to go first? Yeah.
I don't want to talk over your time, Doug. So in terms of reflectors on the blade, that could be an option, but at the moment, as John mentioned, we are quite limited to what the Civil Aviation Authority will and won't allow. So at the moment, we hoping they will allow black blades, and of course in South Africa, at least, most of the species that are affected are fly during the day, not at night, although in different areas that could be different. And then in terms of the whistles, I can't imagine that the wind farms would love that because it might create drag. But what they have used at some sites are audible deterrents. So they would have camera devices on the turbines, or sometimes they might use radar, or in one case they're using people, and they have something like a siren to deter birds when they're in the area. Sort of globally, evidence to support the use of deterrence, certainly in the long term, isn't that positive. And there's also concern that you might give the bird a fright and it lines up flying into the turbine. And then as any farmer will know, birds also tend to become habituated to constant noise. So audible deterrents aren't ideal.
Yeah, and they found similar things where they tried ultrasound to encourage bat avoidance. So that actually bats get used to sounds. So it only works in the short. The key thing though here is that the CAA has really tight rules about what you are and aren't allowed to do with vertical structures and turbines. Their starting point is that they should all be painted white. And so the move towards getting them to allow painting, blade patterning and painting is a big step forward.
Okay, that's great. Let's hope that it is effective.
Yeah.
Then Jessica asks about the bustards, saying, although it's only a few reportedly killed, is there any mitigation that's viable for these? Because I would imagine that they're a bit different from, say, the vultures and eagles in the way they fly.
Yes, I mean, clearly shutdown on demand would have some effect, but because they will walk under the blades and fly up towards, but the real problem with bustards and corans is actually much less the wind turbines and more the transmission lines. And so the other part of our work is to make sure that people are putting reflectors and rotators and various other sort of avoidance or visual devices onto transmission lines. And that's probably going to be the more important action in the case of the terrestrial birds.
Okay, thanks for that. And now Rob Simmons, who's no stranger to either of you, I think, and works a lot in the wind farm or space, especially with black harriers, asking about that wind farm you mentioned in the Northern Cape, Sam, that had the 50 or close to 50 fatalities, whether any mitigations have been implemented and if there were any threatened or endangered species involved there. Do you know?
Offhand, I can't recall if there were any threatened or endangered species there, but if there were, the numbers were pretty low. So it was by far the majority made up by relatively common things like swifts. And was any mitigation implemented? Rob, you know how it goes. So the specialists did recommend mitigation, but whether it's been implemented yet. So one of our challenges is that it can often take a lot of time between the specialists recommending something and actual implementation. So I cannot confirm whether they are currently implementing anything, but it's an interesting case.
Thanks for that. And Sam, another quick one for you from Louise about that graph that you showed with the fatalities. Just remind us over what time period were those fatalities recorded?
So that was the longest monitoring. I can give the turbine years if I can just find my presentation quickly. It's not on this one. So I would have to get back to you. So the wind farms have been monitoring for between 8 years and some less than 1 year. So that's why the actual figures are birds per turbine per year, because we've sort of averaged across the period of monitoring. But yeah, I would have to go back and remind myself what the actual turbine years were.
Okay, thanks. And then there were two questions, similar again, from Paula and Cheryl, asking about ocean wind farms, offshore wind farms. And this is something that the Seabird team has been engaging a little bit with Sam on, and the policy and advocacy team. So yeah, Sam, I don't know if you want to take this and just give a very brief summary of what's happening with offshore wind farms in South Africa and the risks of impacts on seabirds and what research is being done.
So until quite recently, we didn't think that South Africa was going to see offshore wind because of the nature of our pretty wild and steep coastline. But with the advent of floating turbines, it's now opened up a whole new environment. The technology is still pretty expensive, and we don't expect to see any sort of large-scale offshore wind development within the next sort of 5 to 10 years. But having said that, the first environmental impact assessment for an offshore wind facility is currently underway. So we don't have any operational facilities in South Africa, and I stand to be corrected, but I don't think there are any in the Southern Hemisphere. There's obviously lots of research being done up in Europe, where they're quite a common feature. But yeah, the actual impacts are much harder to monitor offshore. As you can imagine, you're not actually find the bird carcasses beneath the turbines. But we certainly do need to start getting our albatrosses in a row in terms of getting adequate data to support the location of wind energy offshore.
I think it's worth perhaps just mentioning here that this is something that BirdLife South Africa is really active, it is looking at the moment, but on an international basis. So BirdLife International is talking to BirdLife South Africa about doing some work around sensitivity mapping that would help us define the problem. And in fact, we've recently, the World Bank and the IFC is now developing an offshore roadmap for South Africa, which will involve, again, sensitivity mapping and will involve BirdLife South Africa as well. We're expecting to consult with us. And that's really the first step. There is quite a lot of work that has to be done before offshore wind is going to be practically possible in South Africa. It's probably, I'd probably say a 5-year rather than a 10-year time horizon. But what BirdLife South Africa is keen to do is to do what Sam was really able to do as we started developing onshore wind, and that's get some of the processes in place so that monitoring the research is being done in advance, and we're not caught on the hoof.
Yeah, that's a great point. We have an opportunity here to really get in at the beginning of the process and help drive it in a sustainable and hopefully having as little impact as possible. Because as Sam said, there aren't any wind farms that I'm aware of in the Southern Hemisphere where we have albatrosses. All the wind farms are in the Northern Hemisphere where they have had variable impacts on different species, but we don't know what's going to happen with the albatrosses in particular. So back onto land. Tony is asking whether there's any evidence that certain bird species are avoiding wind turbine dominated areas. They've shown this, just jumping back to offshore, they've shown avoidance by seabirds of wind turbines, but has there been any evidence of that for onshore?
So certainly in Europe, there are some species that avoid. In South Africa, there's no robust evidence of avoidance that I'm aware of, but it could just be a matter of we haven't delved into that data strongly enough to demonstrate it. Nothing obvious jumps up yet.
Okay, thanks for that. I see it's just gone 8 o'clock, so my lights may go off any minute now. Hopefully my internet will stay stable, so just warning you if that does happen. So we'll go to another couple of questions. One from Roger saying, why is only one blade painted? And then linked to that, I think, is from Femi asking, did the Civil Aviation Authority give any reason why they only allow one or only allow red as the color? So I don't know, okay, John, sure. If you want to.
Yeah, so the simple answer, you don't want to paint all the blades. The evidence is that what you need to do is you want either, you can have multiple blades painted, but they have to be painted in alternate bands and so on. So you want to create a pattern that breaks up the smear effect, motions smear. And so it's kind of a bit like if you imagine when you do, if you were a child, I can remember doing this, you'd put stickers or whatever on your spokes on your wheel, so that as it turned, you could see the spokes turning and it created a pattern. And actually that's all you're doing with these wind turbines. And remember, they're moving quite fast. So actually you don't want all the blades painted one color. Painting one blade about a third of the way up will have the effect that's needed in allowing birds to see more easily. So that's simple. And why is it red? Well, the CAA has a limited number of allowed colors, and of the allowed colors, red is the best for birds in terms of letting them see. And so we would love to do it in black, because sort of what you want to do is a color that is as contrasty as possible with white. Hence, the obvious solution would be black. You're not allowed to do that, so red is the nearest. And it actually appears to work quite well. They have done some experiments in the lab, I think, not in South Africa, but elsewhere, but does suggest red works.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Susan asks whether people can volunteer to be bird spotters, or how can people kind of get involved at a more sort of in-depth level, I guess.
That is a fantastic question. I love it. I don't see why not. It would be ultimately up to the relevant wind farm whether they were willing to allow a bird spotter on the wind farm. I'm presuming this is for shutdown on demand. But I do know that the local bird club in Jeffreys Bay is very, very active in supporting and training the team doing shutdown on demand. So if you are in an area where there is a wind farm, I would suggest get in touch, or if you don't have the contact details, maybe get in touch with me and I'll try and connect you. But I think that's a wonderful idea.
Absolutely. We need more people who are interested in birds out there, keeping an eye out for them. So Ray asks about wind turbines in Lesotho posing a threat to raptors, specifically bearded vultures. And Sam, you mentioned that it doesn't seem like they're at risk. So asking for a bit more details there, and if there is something happening in Lesotho, is BirdLife involved?
Yeah, the Letseng wind farm, or proposed Letseng wind farm in Lesotho was probably, death by fire for me. It's the first case I really had to deal with when I joined BirdLife South Africa. It overlapped with bearded vulture and Cape vulture and a whole bunch of other species. And it had environmental approval. Fortunately, that project has gone dead essentially after some rather hectic meetings with the developer. The threat hasn't entirely gone away. We often hear about developers scoping for opportunities and even beginning to do monitoring in the area. So yeah, we need to keep an eye on that, and hopefully by the time development is realized in that area, we would have some robust mitigation and robust oversight and enforcement measures in place. But for now, the threat is still there, but not immediate.
Okay, that's good to know. And I know that our team does keep an eye out very closely on all these impact assessments, and that's also where members of the public can help us by alerting us to any potentially problematic developments. So another question from George, asking about biodiversity offsets, and we know that's kind of right at the end of the scale where we don't want to be, we'd rather avoid and mitigate. But asking, as a biodiversity offset, could wind farm developers pay for retrofitting power lines to make them more bird friendly? What sort of offsets are there for wind energy?
John, can I answer this one?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Go on. Why don't you? I know we're both laughing because this is actually quite a live topic.
Yeah. It is a very live topic. At the moment, it's not something BirdLife South Africa supports for newly proposed facilities, but one of the big challenges that so many wind farms that are already with environmental authorization, where they are presenting even operational facilities that are having impacts on things like Cape vulture. And certainly for those operational facilities, looking at offsets is one of the things that they are doing. And in fact, some of the wind farms have paid towards retrofitting power lines. One of our big concerns for sort of currently proposed projects is that we don't have good data on how many vultures are killed per kilometer of power line, and that's not bird safe. We need to get that data, and then demonstrating what's known, and this is quite getting into the technical side of things, but demonstrating additionality is also a challenge. So this is stuff that Eskom should be doing already, and perhaps they have plans to do it already, and there might be a whole bunch of technical reasons why they're not doing it quicker. But we need to kind of be able to measure how much quicker a wind farm paying is going to actually make that happen. Technical, but yes, it's definitely something we need to look into in the future.
Absolutely. Just a note, Oliver, I don't know, sorry, Valine, saying there's a new proposal around Afriski on the cards. So maybe that's something to keep an eye out for if you don't know about it already.
can I ask Feline to send me an email with that information, please?
Yes. Maybe Sam, well, your email address is easy. It's energy@birdlife.org.za. So please do, if you know anything about that Afri-Ski proposal, please email Sam. Okay, I'm just trying to look at the rest of the questions. Eddie asks about farm windmills that have the spiraling paintwork on them, so that it gives a sort of expanding illusion. Do you know if that's kind of been looked at? Do you think that would work?
I think the answer is it's not being looked at. One of the things that you might, and we would have problems with, if you did that on a very large scale, on a utility scale wind farm, is I think you might attract a lot of opposition around the visual intrusion. So that there is an issue there. I think it's a great idea. I mean, it might be fun to do an animated version of it, to see what it would look like visually. But I think in reality, visual intrusion would become a significant issue there.
Yeah, I guess we need to remember that these wind farms are kind of, although they're sort of out in the farmlands, they are still where people live and see them, and there can be opposition to them from a purely visual point of view, not for any impacts on birds.
Yeah, I mean, onshore wind farms, one of the two big sources of opposition from people is often noise and the visual impact. So you want to, and that's really why most wind farms globally, in general, have been painted white, and it's to minimize. That's demonstrated as the least visually obtrusive color to paint them. So we're trying to pull them away from that as gently as possible by saying just a bit of red would really help.
Yes. Yeah, that's quite a tricky balance to walk there between making them visible to birds, but not too visible to humans. A question from Herlinda, and apologies if I'm pronouncing your name wrong as well. Going back to marine birds, asking if you know anything about what's happening in the Netherlands, for example, handling marine birds and wind farms, and whether data are available, because as they point out, that terrestrial wind farms are, you know, much more visible and there for people to see, whereas the offshore ones can be sort of out of sight, out of mind.
Well, I think one of the things that we will do in looking at developing guidelines, just as we have for onshore wind, is look at the experience in Europe. It has to be said, though, I mean, as you'll probably hear, I'm English. The amount of opposition to offshore wind farms, which are particularly where they're quite close to the coast, is quite significant. So we need, again, we'll just have to look at the lessons learned and take account. I think, again, in terms of blade paint patterning, it will be something similar to what's allowed on land, would also work, and will probably work as well offshore.
Okay, great, thanks. And I think we'll call this the last question. Another one from George, a very prolific question asker. Thanks for your interest, George. A follow-up question regarding operator responsiveness to shutdown requests. Do they have financial or other incentives to obey, or would they rather ignore the request because they can sell more power?
The amount of power that is lost is really small. I don't think that would be a reason for not shutting down. I think there are lots of reasons why an operator might kind of not be responsive enough, but I don't think it would be an economics question. Maybe
just to add to that, 5 years ago, we experienced a lot of resistance from developers when shutdown on demand was proposed as mitigation measures in the EIA. Then, oh, it's not going to be financially feasible, we're going to lose so much power. It hasn't been borne out in reality. The wind farms that are implementing it are reporting very small losses of power. Of course, it depends on where the wind farm's located. If they're on top of a vulture colony and having to shut down every 5 minutes, it's going to be a different story.
Absolutely. But that is great that it isn't causing big economic damage, because that lessens the protests they can make about it. So I think we'll leave it there. I've bombarded you with enough questions from the audience, but it's great to see that people are so interested and have so many great ideas and thoughts about this. So thank you very much to our audience. And Sam and John, thank you very much for your time this evening and sharing your amazing work. I don't know if you have any last sentiments you want to share with us before I close off.
I'm good. I mean, just please do get involved. I mean, one of the key points that we made at the end there is it's really valuable to have people sharing information. If you hear of projects that are coming up or are progressing and there are concerns, do contact us, and we're happy to follow up.
That's great. Nothing further on my side, just thanks everybody for your interest and support. We really appreciate it.
Great, yeah, and thanks very much to you too, and again to our audience, thanks for joining us for Conservation Conversations, and please do join us again in 2 weeks' time for the next episode. Good night, everyone.
Good night.